This year we mark Earth Day at the back of a natural disaster in KZN which has claimed the lives of more than 400 people. The theme is Invest in Our Planet. The focus today is on accelerating solutions to combat climate change and to activate governments, citizens and businesses to play their part in this process. To unpack this further, we're joined now by Ghaamid Abdul Basat, who is the co-director of earthday.org Africa. He joins us from Germany this morning. Ghaamid, it's great to talk to you, and perhaps quite sobering here in South Africa in particular on the back of what's unfolded in one part of our country, those mudslides triggered by unseasonably heavy rains. It's a difficult thing to juggle, isn't it? Governments trying to do their best for their citizens just in terms of the basics, but also focusing on climate change objectives. But as we now know, the two are so very interlinked.
Absolutely, that's correct, Michelle, because on the other hand, actually climate impacts are seriously affecting the most vulnerable communities. And speaking of vulnerable communities, Sub-Saharan Africa, from southern to eastern to western Africa, are the most affected in terms of the climate impacts, from more floodings and more droughts. And I'm really sorry for the situation happening in South Africa in the meantime. But actually, those are the impacts of climate change, meaning the extreme events, from the flooding events to extreme serious mudslides, as well as serious impacts in terms of human life, and actually even in the issue of sustaining livelihoods of the people and affecting the economies of the people.
Mudslides we've seen in KwaZulu-Natal, we've seen a big impact on agriculture, and as you say, Ghaamid, particularly when it comes to agriculture in large parts of the African continent, women are the ones that are impacted the most in that respect.
Absolutely, that's really correct, and that's why the theme for us this year, Investing in Our Planet, actually one of the focus areas is actually investing in the community groups which are specifically underrepresented. For example, the women group. These are actually the groups which are seriously getting affected because they are actually the ones managing the normal livelihoods works, for example, managing homes, managing electricity, managing water, and therefore if they're impacted, then we're actually having serious impacts to these community groups because they're actually the most affected. And without forgetting that in terms of natural resources, in terms of their engagement in natural management, is actually a serious case because they are also underrepresented in terms of management, and therefore we need approaches that are actually able to invest in these kind of groups that are actually underrepresented.
We've been having this conversation for many, many years. Have you found that governments, particularly, let's say, on the African continent, in parts of the continent, that they are approaching it with more urgency now?
I can say in terms of a simple cost-benefit analysis, with respect to the carbon emissions given out by the sub-Saharan African countries, they're actually a minimal amount as compared to the developed countries. And therefore, our commitment requires more in terms of investing in terms of financial mechanisms to adapt to the impacts of climate change. I spoke earlier about we are the most vulnerable communities in terms of climate change and climate impacts. But again, the governments require more political will in terms of bringing out an African-focused ways on how to tackle the impacts of climate change. Like, for example, we are actually advocating, we are the global education program. We're actually calling on climate literacy programs in terms of having a school curriculum which is actually climate literate, engaging youngsters from lower level and even the university level, ensuring that everyone is actually knowledgeable about climate changes, the climate science, and ways to adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And therefore, actually, the level of policy making is really serious, and I can say we are not necessarily doing enough, but we need all stakeholders on board, from developed to the developing countries, in terms of adapting the serious impacts of climate change.
Africa-focused impact of climate change, what would that entail, and how would it be different from the developed world, Ghaamid?
First of all, on the scenario of contribution of greenhouse gases emissions, Africa contributes even lesser than 2% of what the global emission is. And actually, Africa is, we all know, it's the carbon sink. It's the carbon sink. It's the main absorber of all the carbon emissions from the developed world. And that's the one end in terms of what we contribute. But again, of what we get in terms of the impacts, we are the most vulnerable communities because we are unable, in terms of our capacity to straight mitigate, and therefore we find ourselves facing the impacts, and therefore we need to adapt to the impacts which have already faced us. Like a good example which you've given in KwaZulu-Natal, because it's basically we are not prepared. Disaster preparedness, the resources are not well with us, and therefore we are the most pressed in terms of African perspective on the climate impacts, especially the impacts of heat waves, the impacts of floods, the impacts of drought, and different impacts which are actually sectoral impacts in terms of agriculture, affecting livelihoods of the people, and the impacts in terms of health of the people, as well as the impacts in terms of actually even the economy of the people.
Yeah, absolutely. It does feel in many respects that large parts of the continent are having to backpedal, that we are lagging behind insofar as our focus on climate change, particularly on the impact that we're seeing in parts of the country, here in South Africa, and parts of the continent as well, on our infrastructure.
Yes, basically even speaking of the impacts in terms of on how we actually adapt, because we are having different scenarios. Like, for example, if the impact poses on in terms of affecting our transport system, infrastructural systems, and other different economical systems, which are actually the main dependent systems in terms of our development, we are actually getting into serious trouble, because speaking of investment, investing in a planet theme, we have something called the green investment. The green investment can't happen if we are the most vulnerable communities, but because green investment requires green bond investment, but again requires green design, and green designs requires resources. We require different ways on how to withstand the impacts of climate change. But again, we find ourselves due to disaster preparedness chain in terms of recovery and preparedness, we actually face the most. And we have this scenario of the Global Climate Fund from the UN Framework on Climate Change. This has been actually a long-term promise, which have actually not necessarily been implemented, but we have at least a part of it. But the funding also needs to be accessible to all countries which are actually eligible and the most vulnerable communities. But we're also looking forward to see how they cannot be more percentage of loan, rather they can be grant, which actually can support in terms of green infrastructure and different ways of how to withstand the impact of climate change, from agricultural sector to transport sectors and other development sectors.
One thing's for sure, there needs to be a lot more urgency than we are seeing in many, many parts of the world. Ghaamid Abdul Basat, let me thank you for your time this morning. He's the co-director of earthday.org Africa. This year's Earth Day, the focus is, and rightfully so, on accelerating solutions to combating climate change, but also activating governments and citizens.